Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we're going to dive into a new report from Headset on the demographics of cannabis consumers. On the line with us is Dan Chemist, our CBD correspondent with Good CBD Products. One of the more interesting facts is the number one demographic for pre-roll consumers is white women over the age of 50. Wasn't really aware of that. Kind of surprised me. So let's see if there's any other surprises. So in this report, it goes on to say, quote, "We attempt to understand how age and gender affect cannabis purchasing habits. As in any industry, cannabis consumers from different generations have different purchasing habits, and the same is true for gender. By looking at things like average item price and basket size, we're able to better understand the way the economy at large affects the cannabis industry. Because the cannabis industry is dominated by millennials, the amount of disposable income available to them has a lot to tell us about what does and doesn't work in the cannabis industry. Big ticket items are going to sit on shelves a lot longer for starters. On average, the younger generations have less to spend on each visit than their normal established counterparts, but they do make a vastly larger share of the overall market. It's not exaggerated to say that Gen Z and millennials combined could make up more than 3/4 of the cannabis consumer base in a few short years. Beyond the simple matter of sales and price sensitivity, these data shows us that there are many soft preferences between generations. For instance, baby boomers still prefer flower even after 5 years of exposure to other options. The youth preference for vaping mirrors that of the tobacco industry, with Gen Z and millennials being much more inclined to do it. When it comes to gender preferences, it's clear that the legal cannabis industry still leans heavily towards men. Men make up over 60% of sales across all generations and spend more on average than women. However, it's interesting to note that when broken down into categories, participation is even in certain areas, mostly ones that are very wellness oriented. The broad preference among women for wellness products persists in the cannabis industry as well. And on the flip side, men prefer products that could be construed more as intense, like concentrates. There's also a slight preference among women for CBD products. Overall, the cannabis industry consumer base behaves according to long-established age and gender preferences and newer but generally accepted ones. However, there are some cannabis-specific caveats, like the way that cannabis intersects with the wellness industry, and this report provides you with detailed look at those.
Yeah, I love Headset, right? Because let's face it, if you're a business, it's like it's Friday today. You know, we know from some of the research we've done, there are certain parts of the city where Friday afternoon, you do a lot of business and then you cater to a specific demographic, right? So that's the day to have the shelf loaded with the thing and do all the stuff that allows you to accommodate that sales opportunity and that demographic. How do you know without the report from Headset? How do you know? You don't know.
Right. Yeah, like you were saying, a third of all sales are on Fridays between the hours of 3 and 5, or at least that's the old data. Yeah, without that, it's vital to have that information. We'll just say that. This article breaks down millennials that make up the majority of cannabis sales. So looking at millennials are 51% plus, down to the silent generation, which is over 74. They make up less than 1%. Baby boomers are only at less than 16%. I think if we were to open up more autonomous buying options like online delivery, vending machines, you'll see a lot more products being purchased by that age group that has more of a tight stigma amongst each other. I think there will be individual purchases once those options for delivery open up. So this next slide says that boomers are still buying flower. So demographic data is broken down into category. Becomes clear that old habits die hard, according to this article. So we can see that still flower makes up anywhere from 42 to 50, makes up anywhere between 38 to 50%. Pre-rolls that I always like to look at remains anywhere from 6 to 12%. Vape pens, very popular, about 1/5 of the market there. Not so surprising is the low amount of capsules and topicals. Not a huge market yet. I think we're going to see massive growth as this market matures.
Hey, I was talking to one of our listeners the other day, okay? And the question came up of how come you guys smoke a lot of pre-rolls, but you guys always say pre-rolls suck. So rather than me go off on that, why don't you explain that?
Well, there's the convenience factor. It's very inexpensive to buy a pre-roll. It's very convenient. you're able to find decent ones. There are good pre-rolls out there, but more often than not, they're bad ones. There's so many manufacturers. We haven't even tried all of them, even though you've been to close to 2,000 stores over the last few years. And
We've tried to try all of them.
yeah, a part of it too is just looking to see how it's constructed. So I look at automation. I sell pre-roll, joint, and blunt rolling solutions, fully automated solutions. And part of that is trying the products, whether it's a Canagar pre-roll or otherwise. I'm looking at the overall market to see how it's been developing over the last 5 years.
Really, because to me, it comes down to this: convenience drives pre-roll sales. And so again, that convenience factor, I'll bet, is 70 or 80% of the driving, the motivation behind the sale most of the time, because they do kind of suck, but they're handy.
The number one question is still, what's the highest THC at the lowest price, or whatever their budget is? And then beyond that, yeah, you want to grab and go. So convenience is definitely a huge factor with that. So moving on to this next slide about top brands per generation. I'm not going to really get into any of the brands, but you do see some that are ranked similar amongst generations between the top 5 brands, from Generation Z to millennials, all the way to the silent generation. At least in Washington State, there's some overlap and commonalities with similar branding.
That's going to be like Highlander. In the end, there's going to be like 3 brands.
There's going to be a lot of consolidation, that's for sure. But right now, older buyers are bigger spenders. So while millennials make up the majority of the market, this article goes on to say, quote, they have the second smallest basket size, meaning that they have relatively low amount each trip. They've spent less than $25 per trip in the past 2 years, with only Gen Z beating them in terms of thrift. This makes sense, as Gen Z is either new to the workforce or just finishing college. So 2 situations that don't denote a lot of disposable income, operating on the simplest theory that people accumulate more wealth and grow their earnings power over their lives. The curve of this graph makes sense. So the silent generation can afford to spend over $30 each trip. And even though that Generation X makes up more than 75% of the market, so on average, silent generation, they're spending $33 and change, down to Generation Z, that's still $23 on average.
So what do you think's your average purchase when you go into a retail store, brother?
My average basket price is probably $10. I might go in there and buy, a vape pen or concentrate at $30. There's a tincture I buy, a 20-to-1 CBD to THC ratio at $100. But mostly it's low ticket items. I go in there just to sample something, and then once a quarter, I'll make a big ticket purchase. And that's kind of like this slide. It's talking about buying more but spending less. So statistics on the average item price by generation bears out that the previous theory of millennials buy lower priced products but more frequently. So the trend line is pretty much more the same. The numbers get higher as you go from younger to older generation, just on a different axis. So millennials and Generation Z both have an average item price of below $14, while the boomer and silent generation are the $15 to $17 range. So more convenient.
Sure. And then
going in and spending
right,
less but more often.
Right. The data, the missing component that we can't have today is unique purchaser frequency, right? Unique customer frequency. So how often, geez, I go to the store every day and buy a $10 pre-roll. You go to the store once a week and buy 7 pre-rolls. We meet at the same mark on the graph, right? And so figuring out ultimately how much of that Gen Z income is going to their weed. I know my frequency. I know what I do. I, like yourself, most of the time I'm buying store samples and testing. So if you did a run on average basket price, it'd actually be pretty low. But when I'm buying for my own consumption, it's basically an ounce every 2 weeks. So, we'll say a hun every 2 weeks, right? And so figuring that out across the market would be very interesting.
I'm sure the percentage of disposable income spent on cannabis for Generation Z is a lot higher than baby boomers, but that definitely would be interesting. I think what's not surprising is that men shell out more money, Moving on from generational differences, you see that the gender plays a significant role in purchasing patterns. So men participate more in the cannabis industry, also spend more on average. So their average item price is close to $15, while women are just below 14. Perhaps increased participation drives this difference as men are more familiar with available products and develop expensive tastes because of it. As with any gender dichotomies in cannabis, however, traditional gender roles probably have something to do with it. So, average item price by gender: females $13.75, males $14.80. That's pretty close. And they split that gender differences by generation. And so, I mean, it's still fairly similar, regardless of how old they are. It's still fairly split, 40% females, 60% males. Um, Gentlemen prefer blunts. So we are just talking about automated rolling solutions. California definitely has a huge blunt rolling market, big culture there. So this article says, quote, while it's sometimes hard to say how traditional gender roles affect sales, it's becoming a lot easier when we break down category sales data by gender. Wellness is a market phenomenon that's almost exclusively marketed to women and is considered inherently feminine. Wellness is also a huge aspect of the cannabis industry, with modern recreational cannabis markets almost all coming after existing medical ones. And within cannabis, there are categories that are much more closely associated with wellness, like tinctures and sublinguals, topicals, capsules, and edibles. Among those four categories, we see the highest participation from women, with over 45% of sales going to women. In every other category except pre-rolls, sales to women are less than 40% of the market. While women may prefer wellness, the other side to that coin is that inhaled cannabis often has a performatively macho connotation: smoking big blunts, taking huge dabs, and so on. And sure enough, the concentrate market is 70% male, with flower close behind at 67%. Whether these gender roles are a good thing is a discussion for another place, but it's clear that they play a role in the cannabis industry. I would infer that
Yeah,
most of the cannagars are probably purchased by men, but as we discussed earlier, most of the pre-rolls are purchased by white women over the age of 50.
everybody's got their outliers, but they kind of fall in the normal of the curves that they're talking about.
Yeah, not a lot of that data was all that surprising, including that CBD products appeal more to women. So looking at the sales by gender, 8.3% women, 5% men. Women spend 66% more of their cannabis wallet on CBD containing cannabis products than men. CBD products are absolutely considered part of the wellness side of cannabis, if not the central part of it. So what's more, that the categories with the highest participation from women are those that tend to have more products containing CBD. So here's some key takeaways. Millennials still dominate the cannabis industry, but Gen Z is the fastest growing age group. Younger generations prefer vape pens over their elders, which lines up with a broader trend in the tobacco consumption. Older generations have slight preferences for wellness, spend more per visit than younger generations. And in terms of gender, men still make up the bulk of cannabis consumers. Women have a strong preference for wellness and CBD, whereas men dominate markets like concentrates and flower. And to conclude this, here's some predictions. This article says, quote, while none of the trends represented by this data are too shocking, women like wellness and older people spend more but smoke less. They do highlight some of the things that make the cannabis industry unique, also some of the trends that will shape the industry as it grows and matures. For one, vape pens are not to be ignored because they're popular with both millennials and Gen Z. Millennials already make up over half the market, so it's safe to say that they're going to be big. It's also worth noting that both these generations like concentrate products at a higher rate than their elders, which could be an intersection for vaping preferences with a more permissive attitude towards recreational cannabis and general use. As for prices, barring drastic changes in the economy, it's safe to say that the millennials and Gen Z will take over the market. Price sensitivity will increase. So having tons of disposable income is not a hallmark of either generation. That said, cannabis use is, and obviously young people will continue to find room in their budget for it, but will continue to enjoy it via a lot less purchases rather than buying bulk premium products. So when it comes to trends in gender, it's clear that wellness will be a big factor for anyone looking to bring in more women into the market. While the cannabis industry has always overlapped with wellness, it's only recently been marketed specifically to that audience, and we suspect that there's more room to grow, especially because men are underrepresented in the cannabis consumer base. And finally, CBD will absolutely be a part of any successful push in the cannabis industry to bring in more women. Women already have a preference for CBD products, and that's already closely associated with wellness. That was a very clear crystal ball. Nothing surprising there. I think all of that data is fairly represented in what we've seen, just kind of boots on the ground and doing our own diligence as we kind of ask our own local people in the West Coast what they're doing. All of this lines up with the trends that we've seen year over year. These reports are really good at validation. There's not a lot about the vape pen correction, but what we've seen in Oregon with them taking the products off the market, and in Washington banning all flavors, that's probably going to have some shift. And so we'll have to kind of see with the convenience factor and the sales and the popularity of vape pens where that goes in the next report. But with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out.